All right, it's 11 o'clock. Let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name's Julian McQuaid, and I'm the Vice President and Director of the Strategy, Policy, and Plans and Programs Division here at CNA. I'd like to welcome you to our event this morning and thank you for taking the time to join us for this important discussion. So before I hand it over to the panel, I'd like to just say a few words about CNA and who we are for those of you who may be new to the organization. CNA is an independent, nonprofit research and analysis organization dedicated to the safety and security of the nation. We do work on a broad range of national security issues, ranging from domestic preparedness to nuclear policy to traditional operations analysis for Navy and military commands. And of course, our research on adversaries and competitors with a focus on China and Russia. Our Russia Studies program leverages social science methodologies, field research, regional expertise, language skills, and deep policy and operational experience to support senior decision makers across the Department of Defense and the broader national security community. So today you're going to hear from our Russia experts who are going to address a range of topics that they've been examining over the past few years. Some of you may know that CNA has one of the longest standing Russia military programs. And actually, one of our claims to fame is that even after the Cold War ended, we maintained our Russia expertise, particularly those focused on the Russian Navy and military more broadly. So our Russia analysts today support US leaders with studies, workshops, conferences. We do a lot of war games, and we focus on everything from battlefield tactics to operational plans and posture to security cooperation and working with partners and allies. In the past couple of years in Ukraine, including both Russia's February 2022 invasion and US and allied and partner efforts to support Ukraine, they've really highlighted how important it is for DoD to understand Russian capabilities, operational planning, military cooperation, and evolving threat perceptions. So today our analysts are going to discuss some of the unintended consequences of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And they're going to address those in three key areas. First, they're going to talk about Russia's mobilization practices. They're going to talk about its nuclear signaling. And then finally, they're going to address the military dimension of Russia's relationships with Iran. So we're fortunate to have the discussion led today by Vice Admiral Michael Franken. Admiral Franken was a career surface warfare officer beginning in the Cold War. He commanded the USS Winston S. Churchill, Desron 28, and Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa. He headed a defense agency as well and had 3 tours in legislative affairs. He spent a dozen years in joint and interagency positions, specializing in operations, planning, policy, and strategy. And he worked at Indo-PACOM, AFRICOM, and CENTCOM. And we're fortunate enough to have him here today with us as a CNA fellow. So we've asked Mike to moderate the panel and lead a discussion with some of our experts, exploring the types of questions that we think a senior defense official needs answered on critical issues related to Russia, and in particular, the implications of its activities and its intentions on US national security. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and I will hand the floor over to Mike to take over.
Well, thank you, Julia. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to a lot of second-order effects and reshaped global politics, alliances, trade, technology, Russia's strategic calculus. Domestically, the mobilization of Russian forces, for certainly longer and more extensive than they intended, strained the economy. Follow-on mobilizations triggered more authoritarian mechanisms to maintain their internal controls. Internationally, Russia's nuclear signaling to the West in an effort to deter Western intervention with technology and weapon systems certainly has escalated tensions and revived Cold War era fears of nuclear confrontation. The invasion has unexpectedly transformed Russia's relationship with others as well, particularly with Iran. Once cautious partners, the two nations have drawn closer due to the shared opposition to Western sanctions, for one, and a mutual interest in resisting US influence. Moscow's growing reliance on Tehran is a surprise. Maybe this Moscow-Tehran alliance will bleed into other areas more important to Iran. We shall see. This invasion yielded not the quick victory, fortunately, but has set off a chain of unintended consequences that we will discuss today. So my experience, just if I can add, for CNA, it's interesting. It goes back to 1985, grad school, where I worked on a 2-year thesis project, highly technical, classified, cutting edge. And CNA at the time, still is was the repository of state-of-the-art ASW modeling and software. Fast forward to 1996 on Capitol Hill, CNA became the go-to organization for cooperative threat reduction and conventional arms reduction backgrounders. And they certainly, I learned then, do more than naval. Since that time, it has never led up to producing DoD relevant assessments and thought pieces. So we have today 4 panelists in the Center of Naval Analysis Russia Studies Program. Paul Schwartz is a senior research scientist. He analyzes Russia's defense and security policy. His work involves Russia's military strategy, capabilities, and doctrine, its campaigns in Ukraine, Syria, and Georgia, its military modernization and arms sales programs, and its defense industrial base. Welcome, Paul. Michael Connell is a specialist in Russia and Middle East. His broad expertise includes the armed forces of Iran and Russia. He has published extensively, both inside and outside of CNA, on these topics for over 20 years. Welcome, Dr. Connell. Dr. Julian Waller is an applied analyst for political and military affairs, elite strategic decision-making, adversaries, systems of governance, civil military relations, and the politics of authoritarian rule and illiberal ideologies globally. Welcome, Julian. And Gabriela Rosa-Hernandez is an associate research analyst. Her focus has been on Russia strategic thought, security orders, conventional and nuclear arms control in Europe, and the Russian military writ large. Welcome, Gabriela. So the title of today's event is Exploring the Unintended Consequences of Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, the Mobilization, Nuclear Signaling, and the Consequential Russia-Iran Relationship. I'd like to ask our panelists to start by discussing and summarizing these unintended consequences across 3 strategic areas. So let's begin with what's going on inside Russia. Moscow's initial multi-pronged offensive stumbled and then failed. The conflict then shifted to southeastern Ukraine, where it has devolved into a protracted war of attrition. I think of it as World War I without the horses and Terminator without Schwarzenegger, melded together. Paul, can you describe how Russia's travails in Ukraine, its resulting mobilization processes, its losses of combat personnel — the British just reported over 1,200 casualties per day in some of their operations — have led Moscow to pursue the campaign that we now have before us? Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Admiral Franken. Appreciate the kind remarks. So I'm going to talk today about the mobilization of Russian military manpower to sustain combat operations in Ukraine. And the most important unintended consequence of the campaign, as you alluded to, Admiral Franken, is the fact that Russia actually had to engage in large-scale military mobilization at all as a result of the conflict, because that was not part of the plan when Russia invaded Ukraine. As has been well covered in many reports now, Russia had expected a quick victory in Ukraine, had planned accordingly, had conducted its operations in that manner, and expected that it would be able to handle the job with the forces that it brought to bear during the initial invasion. But instead, as everyone knows, it encountered substantial resistance right from the beginning from Ukrainian forces, resulting in significant casualties early on, which have continued throughout. Massive casualties that it was unprepared to handle and did not have plans to mobilize to replace those forces. And so when it found itself in that position, it was forced to struggle, to improvise, to try to utilize a variety of methods to sustain its combat power. in the Ukraine war. And this in turn has caused all kinds of problems for the Russian military. These problems can really be traced back to decisions made after the Georgia War in 2008. Prior to that, Russia had inherited the Soviet-era mass mobilization military system, a system that was designed to have hundreds of skeletal cadre divisions that could be filled in through mobilization in time of a major war with NATO. And Russia continued to maintain this structure after the collapse of the Soviet Union, partly out of resistance to military reforms and partly out of inertia. But the plan was for during a major war, the Russian would mobilize its reservists, fill in these cadre divisions, and send them to the front to support some frontline forces that were forward deployed in the Central Europe. What happened after the collapse is that Russia found itself in wars like the two wars in Chechnya, the war in Georgia, wars that did not require a mass mobilization army, that instead required permanent ready forces that it could rapidly deploy to these trouble spots and to be effective immediately in conducting combat operations. And the war in Georgia showed that instead what Russia had to do was to cobble together forces from all over the country to assemble combat units and then to thrust them into battle, which caused problems with cohesion, interoperability, etc. So after that experience, Russia launched major military reforms following the war, which included disbandment of the Soviet-era mass mobilization military. Instead, they decided to shift to a force that was based on permanent ready brigades that could be immediately put into combat for emerging wars on their periphery. And they also, in conjunction with this, disbanded most of their mobilization capacity, eliminating commissariats around the country, ending training units that were designed to train mobilized reserves and so forth. And in retrospect, this proved to be a potential mistake because ultimately when they found themselves in the war in Ukraine, they needed a larger force, and disbandment of the mass mobilization military had resulted in a substantially smaller force, which was incapable of handling the task at hand in Ukraine. At the same time, when they found themselves in desperate need of additional combat soldiers, their mobilization machinery had been largely disbanded as well. Now, they had made some efforts to introduce reforms between the new look initial reforms and the war in Ukraine, establishing a ready reserve force, providing for exercises of activating reservists, and even retaining some additional military equipment to staff newly reserved personnel. But these were very much a work in progress at the time of the war and wholly inadequate to meet the demands of the Ukraine conflict. So what ended up happening is when Russia needed these troops, these additional forces to mobilize, it didn't have the capacity to do so. And moreover, Russia's mobilization efforts faced major political constraints because Putin had gone to war expecting a quick victory, not wanting to burden the Russian people with the challenges of staffing a large-scale protracted war. He called it a special military operation instead. And as a result, he was extremely reluctant to actually engage in true mobilization, calling up reservists from across the country. So instead of that, the Russian military, which was already constrained by inadequate mobilization machinery, also now had to make do with ad hoc measures improvised on the fly to try to sustain its combat power in Ukraine without actually calling up activist reserves. And I'll get into this in more detail subsequently, but that has been a major challenge for Russia, resulting in problems in recruiting, problems in military operations, and problems in sustaining the force.
Well, thank you, Paul. I wonder if the special military operation is now talked about in the Russian streets as the big lie. So, meanwhile, in the West, our initial support to Ukraine was admittingly tentative. And many of the weapon systems that would have been helpful early in the conflict, well, we just didn't share those, and we took a more reserved approach for obvious strategic issues. So, Gabriela, could you please share with us your perspective of the Kremlin signaling with its strategic and conventional weapons and how that has affected NATO's decision process? And add your sense into what we can expect going forward, please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Admiral Franken, for having me here. And I do want to say, first of all, that a lot of what I will be saying will be based on a report that we have on Russian nuclear discourse that will be available on our website shortly. I would also like to thank the Russia Strategic Initiative for its support for the CNA Russia Studies program. So first of all, I want to set the stage a bit. So nuclear weapons have definitely played a role in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine from really pretty much the very moment that Vladimir Putin in February 2022 decided to place the country's nuclear forces on high alert. He also warned that anyone who intervened would face consequences greater than you have ever seen. So this particular speech has provided essentially, well, did provide an implicit framework for Russian officials then to follow. So I will be speaking overall about three main things to kind of keep an eye on, which I perceive that are the main shifts in Moscow's nuclear policy and posture. These are Moscow's decision to enter into a nuclear sharing agreement with Belarus. Second of all, Russia's announcement that it will update its public doctrine. And third of all, overall, I want to speak briefly on Moscow's nuclear signaling overall and the thinly veiled nuclear threats. So let's begin with Russia's decision to begin a nuclear sharing arrangement with Belarus, which is by far the boldest move in Russian nuclear policy and posture since the war began. So this is particularly important because during non-proliferation treaty review conferences, Moscow strongly maintained that NATO's nuclear sharing agreements were contrary to the NPT, and now it's essentially beginning a nuclear sharing agreement with Belarus, although nuclear weapons will be under Russia's control. So why does it matter overall, the symbolism of the move? Russian nuclear weapons will be returning to Belarus after the 1990s. We particularly found it very interesting in our report that this was a move that was not really publicly debated or discussed by the writings of the Russian military nor experts themselves. And it is just a further overall, and for me, it was particularly fascinating that Russian experts themselves perceive that Russia's nuclear policy and posture is actively evolving during the war, and they used this primary example overall. So, second of all, I want to speak about the announcement that Russia will update its public doctrinal documents. So first of all, Russia's public doctrinal documents, they stipulate kind of the role of nuclear weapons in Russian strategy, and they overall give kind of the conditions in which Russia would employ nuclear weapons. So in particular, this kind of began in the initials of the war with a lot of Russian experts talking about it, particularly also many people from the Russian military also writing about it, about how this kind of particularly needed to be a move in order to more credibly convey Moscow's seriousness. So in June 2024, President Vladimir Putin particularly said that Russia's public doctrine was a living instrument. And this is kind of where the overall shift began until, we got the confirmation particularly that this was an ongoing process at the moment. Peskov recently said that, and I think this is really the most important part about the move, is that it is a signal towards the West, and it is portrayed very much in Russian writings as kind of one step in the escalation ladder of steps that Russia can take in order to bring back credibility to its nuclear signaling. Now, third of all, I want to touch very briefly on the overall, the what we call the elephant in the room, uh, Russia's thinly veiled nuclear threats. So I will say a very couple of brief remarks since there's already so much on it. Uh, this has been an ongoing conversation in Russian writings, in particular among Russian elites, on how Moscow's bluffing has resulted essentially in a loss of credibility in terms of its signaling. And as a result, there's been some pretty heavy noise, nonlinear noise about what possible steps can Moscow take in order to restore its coercive credibility. And something that I do want to bring that is particularly unique about this is that, yes, it's heavily debated by Russian elites on how to fix these perceived issues, but these debates do not wrestle with the credibility of Moscow's actual threats, because then inevitably you'd get into a discussion about war aims. And who wants to get into a discussion about war aims in Russia today? So in particular, the backdrop of this is kind of this view that many people perceive that the West believes that Russia will never use nuclear weapons. And Putin also particularly referenced this very recently. So why should it matter, I think, is overall, I think it really just matters in terms of that loss of credibility, and that the repeated nuclear signaling from the Russians has made it all the difficult for the West to actually discern its signaling, which could lead us into a potentially dangerous situation. So these three issues that I've aligned now, and I've spoken about, I perceive that those are the three main unintended consequences in the nuclear realm, given the fact that initial Russian assumptions about its war on Ukraine was that they would be greeted with bread and salt and that it would be a short conflict. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriela. Very thorough. So let's delve into regional realignments as a result of the invasion. History would not suggest that Moscow and Tehran would have a symbiotic relationship. Doubly so after Russian clear aggression on a neighbor. But here we are. So, Julian, could you speak a little bit about arms transfers and the altering relationships and how we got here today regarding the Russia and Iran duet, please?
Sure, not a problem. Thanks for having us here to talk about this important relationship and its changes. And many thanks to you, Admiral Franken, for your questions.
Sure.
In various ways, Dr. McConnell and myself have been working on this issue, as well as general dynamic changes and trends in Russian foreign policy since the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war. I'll provide some very brief initial remarks, and Dr. Connell will do some of the fielding of further initial questions, especially those associated with the military dimension of the relationship. Overall, Russia-Iran ties received a significant boost as a result of the Ukraine conflict. Prior to 2022, the relationship could best be described as, to some degrees, lukewarm, and many analysts predominantly viewed it as primarily transactional, right? Iranians were more eager and the more junior part of the two parties, and Iran courted Moscow as an adjunct to their look east policy, part of a larger bid to reduce Iran's isolation on the international stage, to attract foreign direct investment, and acquire advanced technology, including military technology. Moscow, however, seemed content to keep Tehran at arm's length, partly to avoid incurring Western sanctions, but also because Tehran had little, relatively speaking, to offer that Moscow truly needed. There are, as you noted, several long-standing constraints on the relationship, including very old historical grievances, as well as newer ones, the desire to maintain autonomy on the international stage, and disappointment over the quality of previous interactions, bilateral interactions, including prior arms sales. The primary context for improvements in the Russia-Iran relationship up to this point was in the Syrian civil war. This was itself an uptick in relations. It was considerable, but still mixed and plausibly transactional in the overall contours and direction of the relationship. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, however, the dynamic shifted considerably, and the two countries were on a more equal footing in certain ways. Russia was now isolated and needed Iran's support, especially the latter's military support. Right? For its part, Iran has been happy to provide this support in terms of large numbers of drones, artillery munitions, ballistic missiles, not just at a transactional level for the cash that military sales generate, but also because collaboration with Russia now objectively reduces Iran's isolation. It increases foreign investment in Iran. As a note, Russia is now a top source of FDI for Iran, while providing an opportunity to stick it to the common adversary, that is us, the United States. Ultimately, to your earlier question on the framing of unintended consequences, the unintended consequences of the war in terms of Russia's foreign policy relations with Iran was a considerable tightening and deepening of the relationship, one that is quickly evolving towards a full strategic partnership that may have long-term effects. And we mean this in perhaps the long term truly, including the potential for path-dependent dynamics that may well outlast both the Russian president and the Iranian supreme leader. That is, we need to think about this relationship not only in the short term, in the instrumental and transactional sense, but in the medium term and the long term. And that decisions made now, deepening happening now, might have impacts, considerable impacts down the road. Therefore, the current Ukrainian and the earlier Syrian conflicts, coupled with the effect of Western sanctions on Russia and Iran, have served as this major impetus for the improvement in the bilateral relationship. Prior constraints on Russia's engagement with Tehran, which were very notably found on nuclear issues and secondary sanctions, these have diminished, relatively speaking. Moscow remains somewhat cautious. We don't want to say that everything is now flowers and daisies in the relationship, but nevertheless, a continued improvement. Furthermore, it is likely that the Israel-Hamas war that's ongoing will indeed reinforce the trend of improved bilateral relations over the short to medium term. It's difficult to predict exactly how this will play out. It would be improper for us to make broader predictions than we can. But nevertheless, the trajectory and the trends do continue towards deepening. I'll mention three dimensions of the relationship and then close. On the political dimension, or the political aspects of the relationship, Russia and Iran now share an increasing geopolitical alignment, not least through the use of civilizationist and anti-Western rhetoric, coupled with increased contact points between government figures through high-level meetings and newly signed memoranda of understanding across a range of issue areas, which has proliferated over time. Notably, senior political elites, rather than just diplomatic elites, are now partaking frequently in these regularly scheduled public meetings. Technical and scientific cooperation is very important here, especially as we'll speak on the military issues, but increasing contact points across the range of key political leaders suggests a more thoroughgoing effort at cooperation, coordination, and just mutual understanding between these two key authoritarian regimes and adversaries of the United States. And of course, given recent reporting, we look forward towards perhaps the imminent signing of a new treaty underlining this de facto already existing strategic partnership. Both sides are quite interested in it, and they're clearly just working through the final details. So on the political side, a considerable increase overall. On the military dimension, we observe a number of significant official engagements by senior level officers, government officials displaying wide-ranging cooperation, including extensive and growing military technical cooperation, which is something that many analysts in the United States are looking at quite closely. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the scale of arms transfers between Russia and Iran increased, including the sales and co-production of military equipment and related training. The evidence that we are tracking also suggests a high incidence of dark port calls, which also supports the idea of growing arms transfers between the two states, not all of which we can identify quite clearly. In addition, bilateral and multilateral military exercises have also increased, which had not occurred in prior years. It should be noted in the military dimensions, there are some areas where there's a little bit more lag, and there's more limited ties. So we want to be nuanced sort of about exactly the ways in which this relationship is deepening. Finally, economic ties traditionally have been a weak point in the Russia-Iran relationship. However, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia and Iran have begun to invest substantially in the development of further bilateral economic ties. This collaboration includes new trade agreements, closer integration of their respective banking sectors, increased cross-border trade, and increased investment in several strategic sectors overall. The new North-South Transport Corridor project in this vein is a major step towards long-term infrastructure development as well. On the economic side of the relationship, we do have to note there is an inherent degree of incompatibility and natural competition between the two economies that will limit to some degree the long-term growth of economic relations. But as it's such early days and the forcing function of the war has been so considerable, there's a great deal of gain still to be had in further coordination and integration of their respective economies on both sides. So sort of to conclude, overall, the unintended consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine have been the removal of a great number of constraints on the Russia-Iran relationship, the sudden revving up of a series of war-induced sort of needs-based drivers, and an increasing unity of effort and worldview that has aligned Russian and Iranian decision makers and decision-influencing elites. It is beyond simple transactionality and has moved towards a strategic partnership that will need to be closely tracked by military and foreign policy analysts working on either countries, as well as those that work on conflicts and tensions in the Middle East and across greater Eurasia. Thanks.
Yeah. All right, very good. We will. I get a kick out of the pictures of the Iranian military officer standing next to Russians overlooking Iranian-made equipment that looks remarkably like it came from the West. So quickly to go back to mobilization, Paul, Russia's mobilization challenges can't come without a significant cost. To be very exact, how has Russia managed to mobilize these sufficient forces to sustain the combat capabilities and the losses? And why have the Russians adopted the various approaches that it took?
Thank you. So Russia has embarked on a mobilization strategy that is far from anticipated. It's very ad hoc in nature. It's adaptive to the circumstances that it found itself in once it entered the war and began suffering massive losses. As mentioned before, Russia's mobilization machinery was not really adequate to the task at this point, having been largely disbanded. And facing serious political constraints by Putin, who wanted to avoid calling up former reservists at any cost to try to replenish the force. So as a result, from February 2022 until September, when Russia faced major counteroffensives from Ukraine in both Kharkiv and in Kherson, Russia adopted what is best termed as a covert mobilization strategy. Yeah. And I'll give Institute for Study of War their due credit for coining that term, but I think it aptly fits what was happening. What this was basically was an ad hoc series of efforts undertaken by the Russian military and quasi-military organizations to recruit new personnel and to send them into the front to sustain the combat capabilities of the force. And these included a very complex array of activities, focusing on the most important 6 of them. It included mobilizing additional contract soldiers for Russia's regular forces. Contract soldiers in the sense that they serve under volunteer contracts for typically 2 to 3 year terms, at least prior to the war. Trying to recruit more of those forces. Also trying to form new volunteer battalions throughout Russia. When the attempts to recruit contract soldiers fell short, primarily because there was not a droves of new recruits signing up to join the regular army when faced with all of the massive combat losses that have been incurred in Ukraine by those forces during this period. So Russia resorted to other methods such as trying to get each of the regional governors to recruit volunteer battalions comprised of troops from that region, under the theory that those kinds of troops would be more cohesive, they would be able to train together and fight together, and perhaps more willing to join those kinds of forces. And to some extent that was successful, Russia did recruit around 52 battalions of different troops, but most of them were poorly trained, had inadequate training before being sent into the battlefield to try to fill gaps in the front, and suffered massive losses in the process. Russia also turned to the Wagner Group and other private military contractors to try to sustain its combat capabilities, trying to take advantage of Wagner's elite image among the Russian people. Wagner also had its own recruiting networks, and to some extent, Russia was succeeded in recruiting new volunteers, mostly former veterans, to join the Wagner Group, under the theory that they would be better trained and better positioned once they got to the front to avoid some of the fate of the Russian regular forces. Russia also resorted to other measures, such as the forced mobilization of combat personnel from the Donbass region, the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, because their leaderships were very beholden to Russia for their survival, and they were much more prone to pressure from the Kremlin to try to support mobilization efforts. This led those particular leaderships in these regions to undertake forced mobilization, inducting significant numbers of combat troops into the force to be sent to the front, undertaking things like street patrols, raids of houses, and the like. Russia also turned to its compatriots in Chechnya to recruit additional Chechen militias, relying on the leadership of Kadyrov, the de facto leader of Chechnya, who had been granted significant autonomy and financial support from Russia, and was therefore willing to try to recruit additional Chechen militia forces for newly formed battalions to be sent to the front. And some of those troops ended up contributing significantly to the sustaining combat capabilities in places such as Mariupol and Zaporizhia. So overall, Russia implemented this rather bizarre hodgepodge series of ad hoc lines of effort to try to sustain its force, and had some reasonable success in recruiting a number of combat troops to at least fill the most serious gaps in its coverage. But these measures proved inadequate during this initial phase to meet the requirements, especially as Ukraine had mobilized substantial forces, enjoyed numerical superiority on the battlefield, and had been able to continue to inflict significant casualties on the Russian forces. And the failure for Putin to call for a formal mobilization of reservists and relying on these various ad hoc groups to try to sustain its combat power, the bill for that finally came due in September 2022, when Ukraine launched its twin counteroffensives at Kharkiv and Kherson. Major breakthroughs in the Kharkiv region put the entire Western Front at risk of collapse, at least in the areas around Kharkiv. And this finally prompted Putin to relent from his prior rigid stance against mobilizing reservists, prompting him to call for the partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists to try to quickly generate sufficient troops to stem the tide in these twin areas where these offensives were taking place. And this particular method suffered from substantial problems from the beginning, primarily because of the disbandment of the mobilization machinery that had taken place after the 2008 Georgia War. Registries had not been kept up to date. Local commissariats started recruiting people from all walks of life, people that had medical problems, people that were overage, people that weren't even former reservists. And they were corralling them into these newly formed units where they were undergoing very limited training because most of the trainers were at the front. And those that were were only able to deliver limited training before these troops could be dispatched to the field. They also suffered from significant shortages of modern military equipment, many of them receiving just a single aging rifle and an old uniform before being thrust into combat. And the initial wave of newly mobilized reservists that were sent to the front proved they suffered massive casualties. But over time, they were just sufficient enough to help blunt this Ukrainian counteroffensive, especially the one at Kharkiv, and restabilize the front. Following this, during the third phase of mobilization, Putin essentially elected to return to a covert mobilization strategy. In this case, relying primarily on the Wagner Group, which was given free rein to recruit new soldiers from Russian prisons, leading to substantial inflow of troops that were poorly trained, quickly thrown into the battle, but were sufficient to make significant progress in some areas, especially around Bakhmut. Russia also returned to mobilizing volunteers, not only for regional volunteer battalions, but also to fill gaps in other forces. But most important, Russia has been able to succeed where it failed before during the first phase in recruiting substantial numbers of contract soldiers for the regular forces. And they've done so basically through two means. First of all, offering enormous salaries and benefits for those willing to join the regular army, and also undertaking a focused information campaign designed to make Army service more attractive, to extol its benefits, to contrast it with some of the bleak opportunities facing those remaining on the sidelines in the civilian sectors, and also appealing to the values that the Russians have typically placed on serving patriotically in the military. And this method in particular has resulted in a substantial increase in the mobilization capacity of the Russian military. They've more or less cracked the code and providing a steady stream of regular soldiers supplemented by volunteers and private military contractors, sufficient to give them a renewed fighting force at the front to stem Ukraine's summer 2023 counteroffensive, and most recently to retain the initiative throughout.
Right. Well, I can tell you what'll cause dissension in the ranks is when the Wagner guy next to you in the trench is getting paid far more than you are as a conscript or a contract soldier. So more to follow on this. Gabriela, is there more substance behind the Russia's ominous threats regarding assisting Ukraine, or is this posturing taken to the next level? And how can the U.S., the DoD writ large, do a better job of signaling our reassurance to our NATO allies and European partners without kicking off an escalation spiral with Russia?
You're out here asking me very difficult questions, but no really easy solutions, but I will do my best. Thank you, Admiral Franken. So first of all, I think your question really is just kind of the forefront of everyone's mind. Is there anything beyond kind of rhetoric? I think that's kind of the main thing. And I think in my opening remarks, I pretty much laid out that the boldest and the biggest change in terms of signaling, because really the main changes that we are seeing are in signaling. And the debate, particularly among Russian elites, are far more focused on signaling rather than anything else, and restoring kind of, that coercive credibility. But so far, in terms of policy and posture, I would say a clarification in terms of, Russia's public doctrine. I mean, that is a signal and that is a shift. I would say, I would reiterate my initial remarks about the Russian decision to station non-strategic nuclear weapons in Belarus. If we don't know if it's done yet or if it's still in progress, I would say that's a pretty dramatic shift from what we saw before. But overall, there's a set of measures that the U.S. and its allies can take, and particularly, and these mostly relate to alliance cohesion. Well, first of all, the United States and its allies need to conduct exercises based on possible Russian escalation pathways far more in order to achieve a better understanding kind of ally dynamics in terms, and also kind of to develop ways in terms of thinking exercises to counter specific escalation pathways. I think that's pretty much the main thing. Second of all, the US and its allies going from the conversations, because the conversations, they are very different, and they each, depending on where the conversation resides from, is kind of just overall what is authoritative and what is not authoritative overall. But I definitely think it's a safe bet that depending on what goes on in the battlefield in Ukraine, the U.S. and its allies definitely need to brace themselves for more Russian gestures and occasional predictability. And to reassure its allies, the United States can enhance the level of its information sharing practices, also along with its partners as well. And lastly, the US and its allies need to continue to credibly communicate the cost of any escalation management steps that Russia might take. And if I bring out kind of, what we call, where I'm from, my old and trusty from my old employer, the United States and its allies can continue kind of in the international stage to reiterate that nuclear threats are inadmissible. So thank you so much. That is my response.
Great. So, Dr. Connell, you've written a lot about diplomatic strategies and weapon Department of Defense's MODs, how they develop relationships between nations. Talk a bit about the diplomatic strategies and how daylight could possibly be achieved in a Russia-Iran relationship. And then, are there strategies the U.S. might adopt to cleave the unhelpful alliances from potentially solidifying, and perhaps renew some partnerships that have gone admittingly stale? I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia. I'm throwing out some countries here: Turkey, other CIS nations. And maybe some of this is best addressed in action after a presidential election. But could you give a once over on that, please?
Thanks, Admiral. I'd be happy to do so. I'm not going to lie to you. I think it's going to be difficult. On the positive side, from our perspective, from the U.S. perspective, Iran and Russia are not really allies in the sense that they don't have treaties that explicitly bind them militarily or diplomatically. Although there is the diplomatic strategic agreement that's being discussed, but for reasons I'd be happy to go in later in the Q&A, I don't think that agreement is going to go quite as far as it's being talked about in the press. Now, although their interests and objectives are more aligned than they've been in the past, there's still a degree of suspicion and mistrust that underpins Russia's relationship with Iran on both sides. I'd say it's perhaps even slightly more on the Iranian side, because there's that legacy of Russia being a colonial power in Iran and occupying parts of Iranian territory in the past. Now, that's the positive side from the U.S. perspective. On the other hand, both countries do view the United States as their number one adversary. And I'm not saying that with a degree of there's no gray area in that. They really both do view the U.S. as their number one adversary. And with the sanctions and the diplomatic pressure that have already been imposed on them, the U.S. has very little leverage to wield over either country. I'd say if we are going to influence the relationship, you already alluded to this, but one way to do so would be through third countries, mainly U.S. partners and allies that we have close ties to, but also have close ties to one or both of those countries. Russia, for instance, maintains positive ties with a number of countries that are U.S. partners and allies in the Middle East. So you would mention Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Those are two. I could also add to that Egypt. Israel is questionable these days, but traditionally Russia had very close ties to Israel.
Yeah.
Several of these countries are inclined to view Iran as problematic. Saudi Arabia probably tops the list in that regard, but some of the other countries, Turkey has an off-again, on-again relationship with Iran that certainly it's been problematic in some ways. Egypt as well. Now, we're unlikely to affect the overall trajectory of Russia's relationship with Iran through these countries, but you could envisage a scenario in which, at a tactical level, for instance, to give you the example of the Saudis, we could ask them to intercede with the Russians to prevent the Russians from exporting a particular weapon system to Iran. The question is, would Saudi Arabia be willing to expend political or economic capital on our behalf? They're going to be more incentivized if the weapon system negatively impacts their security. You could hypothetically, for instance, what if the Russians were to share hypersonic missile technology with the Iranians? That's something that would certainly upset US allies in the region. But even so, Washington's relationship with a lot of these countries isn't what it once was. And it's also unclear, like in the case of Saudi Arabia, whether Saudi Arabia would acquiesce to the US request, or that Moscow would acquiesce to Saudi Arabia's request. So barring any unforeseen developments, that's my out for future predictions. I'm skeptical that any wedge driving strategies would actually succeed, except perhaps on narrowly focused issues of mutual concern.
Right.
Thank
Roger. Julian, I'm going to ask you to add to that if you have anything to say. But in the meantime, if you have questions in the viewing audience, please send those to us in the chat. Julian, do you have something to add over?
Sure. I think Dr. Connell hit the nail on the head with that one. In general, it's going to be very, very difficult to engage successfully in a wedge strategy vis-a-vis the Russia-Iran relationship for all the reasons suggested. Mike mentioned quite a number of complicated dynamics within the Middle East that makes it so there might be some areas at the tactical level or in sort of small scale, very highly specific conditions where the U.S. might be able to do so, but we are not in as a place as we used to be to leverage relationships necessarily, or to drive the two apart. And furthermore, it gets back to what I was mentioning earlier about the changing calculus of constraints and drivers. Is that even given continued generic suspicion and continued historic grievances and tensions between Russia and Iran, those constraints are just simply much, much less than they used to be. Elites, at least for now, think of them a little bit differently. They're on the relative back burner. Although we should be careful, because internal Iranian domestic politics, although a highly authoritarian regime does have dissensus on the Russia question. There are voices that say that Iran should be more skeptical. But sort of holding everything equal, ceteris paribus, we shouldn't expect a major dive beyond, again, unforeseen events taking place.
Right. So, over the weekend, I expected to read of a dislodging of the Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region and offensives elsewhere in the east to take the heat off put the heat on Kiev to shift forces, but I've not seen that. So, Paul, is there a quality of force issue with the Russians in the field that is not getting fixed over the course of the combat?
So yes, with respect to mobilization, trying to link it back to that, Russia's mobilization efforts, this ad hoc, multi-dimensional mobilization strategy, has definitely had some pernicious effects on both Russian force generation as well as the combat capabilities in the field. Now, that's not the sole contributing factor to Russia's performance problems in Ukraine, but it has helped to contribute to them and sustain them as well. For one, reliance on such a wide range of mobilization mechanisms has undermined the unity of effort involved in simply mobilizing additional personnel. You have all of these competing mobilization strategies, with Wagner trying to recruit troops for its PMCs at certain points in the campaign, the regular forces trying to recruit new contractors, and volunteer battalions recruiting for their particular units and so forth. They have competed against each other in many respects. In some cases, they've gone after slightly different populations. but has prevented the Russians from imposing a unified system of mobilization to maximize the effect of that. Secondly, for similar reasons, resulted in a patchwork of combat forces in the field, a mix of both regular and irregular forces at different parts of the front. You have private military contractors, Donbass irregular soldiers, fighting alongside regulars, and different levels of quality and training, poor interoperability. This has been complicated even further by lack of a unified command chain structure in many cases, especially early on, where Chechen militias, for example, took their orders from Kadyrov and not from the MOD. And feuds between the Wagner Group and the MOD have been notorious, were notorious, I should say, during much of the war, since receded with the death of Prigozhin and the diminished capacity of Wagner. But those have played a role as well. Moreover, the urgent need for new troops throughout the war and these somewhat incoherent and underperforming mobilization methods has often led to the rapid deployment of troops with no prior military experience, and those often receiving poor training, as little as 5 days in some cases. And throwing them into combat has significantly undermined the overall quality of the Russian combat forces in Ukraine. It has more or less led to the adoption of new tactics and strategies, such as using continuous infantry assaults against frontal assaults against dug-in Ukrainian forces, trying to identify gaps, and then once those have been identified at great loss, then throwing in more seasoned combat forces to try to exploit those openings. But this in turn has continued to generate even more losses, which has perpetuated the need for additional troops. So collectively, the mobilization effort has contributed to Russia's continuing travails in Ukraine. And that, along with poor leadership, training problems, logistics, etc., has the result that can be seen in the failure to dislodge forces from Kursk and the continued incremental gains that Russia has been making on the battlefield in Ukraine. Thank you.
Great, you bet. So, Gabriela, Putin has backstepped, I think, from his nuclear saber rattling by being more reliant on conventional means. But if the Kursk salient can't be dislodged or expands further to the north, what are Russia's options, would you say?
Well, thank you for that question. I think that's the question on everyone's minds, especially if they follow nuclear issues, honestly. I think the way that we think about, I think really what the Kirk situation brings out is just a change overall in the way that we should think about nuclear doctrine and deterrence overall, and kind of just the wide array of factors that actually really matter in terms of, when coming to a decision on what possible steps to take. When it comes, and I do want to bring out my contingent, which is fluid on what depending on the battlefield. If you read Russian and you see what they're saying about the possible steps they could take, much more of the hardliners basically saying, oh, like, we can't rule out a demonstration, or we can't rule out more assertive actions, we can't rule out more exercises. And I think overall, I'm going to go a bit into, and I'm going to dive into the controversial topic of kind of, this prevalent kind of notion, particularly in the West, that, we can continue and carry on. This only shows that, Moscow is not going to commit, that it is not going to do anything. I want to dive into that a bit more, because Moscow indeed, in terms of, answering kind of how, the increased military assistance that Ukraine has gotten from the West, Moscow has escalated its sabotage activities in Europe as a whole. Moscow has amped up its signaling through the steps that I've particularly spoken about in my initial remarks. So therefore, again, there's no easy solutions, and it brings us to a conversation really about the political utility of nuclear weapons, and actually, how can you use them as a tool against essentially a non-nuclear adversary, which I think deserves far more research and is a completely different conversation. Did I satisfy you with my answer?
You did. And if we have time here before the end of it, because we're all tacticians at heart, I'm going to ask you what cache of security cooperation material we could possibly, hold on.
Time to go to audience questions.
Alexa off. Sorry. I'm using Alexa to do my timing here. So before I get off a line here, I want to ask people what the different cache of security cooperation material is in military material that wouldn't be helpful to Ukraine in the conduct of this conflict, and then also what might be in the offing for Russia. But Michael, the Russian economy shrank by well over 2% in 2002, and I believe has contracted even farther, even as the rest of the world is rapidly in a post-pandemic expansion. How are the two countries enabling sanctions evasion while they're supporting military operations? And should we expect further military-to-military cooperation with other nations to fill in the gap of what's needed in Russia and what's also needed in Ukraine? Over.
Well, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think the two countries are definitely using techniques to trade with each other and evade sanctions. So they're engaging in barter trade. They're using cryptocurrencies, using techniques that are very common to sanctions evading countries, like turning off AIS transponders on ships,
Sure,
which makes those ships difficult to track. Iran has so Russia's in somewhat of a new position in terms of having the amount of sanctions that have been imposed on it. It isn't new to Iran. Iran's been doing this for 4 decades. And for this reason, I think Russia can learn something from the tactics and the techniques that the Iranians have developed. In terms of you mentioned the military cooperation. Well, it's clear they're collaborating militarily. There are a lot of gaps that the Iranians and the Russians have addressed on both sides of the equation. The collaboration between the two countries actually predates the current Ukraine conflict. It goes back to the Syrian Civil War. So during the Syrian Civil War, the Russian Air Force was providing close air support to Iranian ground troops in Syria. The two countries also established an intelligence and operations coordination.
Alexa, cancel 12:25.
You don't have your alarm set for 0:25.
So in the current conflict in Ukraine, Iran has been exporting large numbers of one-way attack UAVs, and that's been in the news heavily. Less in the news is the fact that they're also exporting artillery shells, so 152 millimeter artillery. And according to recent reports, they're also exporting close-range ballistic missiles, the FA-360. They're also, interestingly enough, the Russians are slated to export a couple squadrons of Su-35 4th-generation fighters to Iran. And for the Iranians, this would be a real game changer, because for anybody tracking the Iranian Air Force, they're still operating cutting edge technology from the 1970s. So they're a bit behind the times in terms of their aerospace power. So this would be a real game changer for the Iranians. I think we're going to see further mill-to-mill cooperation between Russia and Iran for 2 reasons. First, the factors that are driving the military cooperation, the threat perceptions, particularly about the US and its allies, the need to acquire advanced military technology from foreign suppliers, and that's on both sides. Those drivers aren't going away. Second, military ties are becoming deeper and more institutionalized. This is one of the things that we found in our study, which was actually a bit surprising, that the cooperation extends below the senior level. It's not just 4-star generals and admirals going back and forth between Tehran and Moscow. It goes down to lower echelons, and it's also extending to key institutional decision-making bodies in both countries. So the National Security Council in Russia and the Supreme National Security Council in Iran are having regular visits and regular exchanges. So this cooperation is becoming more institutionalized, and it indicates that mill-to-mill relations between the two countries are no longer purely transactional. Now, I couldn't leave it with all those negative thoughts. There are barriers to cooperation as well. So for both sides lack cash, particularly the Iranians. So one thing that the Russians are looking for right now is investment and access to Western technology. And on both of those areas, the Iranians aren't necessarily a good source. So both sides need to develop workarounds to get access to that technology. But overall, I'd say in terms of mill-to-mill ties and in terms of collaborating, particularly filling gaps on both sides, the two states are on a positive glide path. Thank you.
So, Julian, real quick, I want to run to the questions from the viewing audience, but do you have anything to add to that, please?
Well, thanks. I think the one thing to add is that there's both value add for Russia to learn from Iranian sanctions busting, which again, they've, as Mike says, they've been doing for many decades. But we do have to keep in mind that Russia has built up considerable knowledge on sanctions evasions over the last 10 years, generally, since the 2014 annexation of Crimea. Right. In fact, Russia started building up various aspects of industrial substitution efforts, right? Import substitution efforts. It built up separate credit schemes and banking schemes so as to rely less on the West. That served Russia very, very well 8 years later when the war broke out in 2022. And Russia has relied on these institutional bases of support because it had already decoupled at least partly from the West. And then with the sudden increase in sanctions at a massive level, qualitatively and quantitatively, they were able to avoid collapse and they were able to avoid economic collapse. The Russian economy contracted in 2022, but it's actually expanded since then. The numbers are a little bit hard to wrap your head around. You need to trust varying institutions that may or may not be trustworthy regards to total numbers, but it's heated up quite significantly, relatively speaking. The Russian budget has expanded dramatically in the military industrial sector. And there's now a massive labor shortage, right, which causes its own problems, including inflation, which is occurring in Russia. But there's a lot of economic dynamism related to the war economy in particular. And a final point is related to this is that after the massive exodus of high human capital professionals, especially in the tech sector, leaving Russia, many of them have come back, actually. They've come back because it's been harder than they expected to live abroad, because the war has gone on long enough, and actually the jobs are better in certain sectors in Moscow and St. Petersburg and elsewhere. And they even have legal protections that the Russian government, through legislation in the State Duma, have provided. So hundreds of thousands have come back, which again provides just an overall a sort of forced, perhaps artificial economic dynamism, which keeps Russia as an attractive partner for Iran, for example.
Well, terrific. So let me get to some questions from the audience. This is a question to Gabriela. What changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine do you anticipate in the future? And if you can do that in just a couple of minutes, that'd be great.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So our upcoming report, which will be released this week on our public website, particularly looks at what are the changes that particularly 3 communities in Russia advocate for in terms of the future of Russia's nuclear policy and posture. And these are civilian experts, Russian officials, and also the Russian military. So we found overall, actually, that first of all, that everyone was far before President Putin make kind of, play dilly-dally with it in June 2024, we actually found that these conversations highly preceded it, and that actively many of these communities were actually advocating for particularly clarifications. It's often spoken of in broad words as in a more assertive policy, and we can get into the Garagan of debate, and we can definitely get into that. But I think something far more realistic is actually just further clarification into what situations may the Russian Federation employ nuclear weapons. I mean, Russia's public documents are already extremely, I consider them very broad for a public doctrine. Others can disagree with me. So kind of, and they pretty much center, this is common knowledge, they pretty much center on territorial sovereignty and the existence of the Russian state. However, President Putin has numerous times kind of played with the overall ambiguousness. I think they're going to avoid getting into a commitment trap. The more specific that you get, you are essentially getting into that, because you don't want to put yourself in a corner where you're actually, and then you're caught bluffing yet again. So I think the reality is that we're going to expect something far more of a clarification, because again, it's not, and I think this is the overall that I want to bring out. Moscow's elites are learning less nuclear lessons from the war. They are de facto taking note. They are taking note of what works and what doesn't work for the future. And the war is essentially, and I think that's the most fascinating thing that we found on the report, the conflict in Ukraine is fueling the evolution of Russia's future policy and posture overall. So that's what I would expect, and essentially, and the deeper we go, again, contingent on what happens in the battlefield in Ukraine, the deeper that we go, really, that is really what it's going to rely on. And in terms of the move is a signal, we can expect more signaling in the future. However, again, highly contingent. That's all.
Great. So Eric Woods asks the question, Russia's demographic issues are causing deficiencies not only in the ability of fighting age men for the front, but also in the defense industry, where massive material losses means an increased op tempo. At what point does a more overt support from Iran, DPRK, China become politically feasible or palatable for elite Russian decision makers? Let me see. That is probably Paul.
I can take a crack at that. So I think more overt support from Iran, DPRK, and China is already to some degree on the table for Iran and the DPRK. They have moved ahead with providing the kinds of weapons that Russia is most in need of at the front. Artillery shells, short-range ballistic missiles, things that are heavily expended during the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It is, and I would submit, with some exception, that for the most part, Russia is not looking to upgrade its military capabilities, technical quality of its equipment, through relations with Iran and DPRK, through buying systems that these two countries produce, with some exception possibly for Iran, which has made significant strides in UAVs, as well as short-range ballistic missiles. In many cases, though, our ammunition supplies from Korea and Iran and short-range ballistic missiles from Korea are more about replenishing stockpiles and the like. In terms of China, China has, thus far, as most people who've been following the campaign know, has refrained from providing overt military support for Russia, providing weapon systems and the like. But they have provided access to advanced Western technology, microchips, materials, machine tools, and the like, through export hubs in Hong Kong, for example. And this has been crucial for the Russian defense industry to maintain production of more advanced technology. China, though, continues to be very heavily integrated in the Western economic system, and has been very loath to do things that could cause it to incur secondary sanctions. And This has served as a constraint on its ability to provide more overt forms of support throughout. And I don't see anything on the horizon that's likely to change that. One possible thing, which has not been tested in the war, really is some kind of a major Russian military collapse at the front. How far would China go, for example, to try to help to save Russia, so to speak,
Sure.
to preserve it as a potential strategic partner? Its only major, really strategic partner in this political battles with the West.
Right. So we might come back to that. Elizabeth has an interesting question here. Since Russia-Iran report was completed, it was confirmed that Iran sent Russia short-range missiles, but without the necessary launchers. This I don't know exactly, but how do you explain this? One article suggested this could be either Russia wanting to provide the launchers or Iran wanting to leave the door open for some sort of engagement with the West, or at least to diminish the negative reaction there. Michael, how about you?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer this. I saw that report. The report's coming out about the launchers not being shipped. First, it is possible that they are going to be shipped and we just haven't detected it yet, because these reports are fairly recent. So I just hold out that possibility. But there are two other possibilities as well. One, I think the most likely reason, if this turns out to be true, that they're withholding the launchers, is that they're looking for leverage. Now, that could be leverage with Russia, in the sense that the Iranians are looking to drive a hard bargain and say, you know, I know we were going to ship these, but we're going to need a little more support with X before we can proceed with that. Or it could be leverage with the West. But I think the leverage in the West case is really to basically have them back down on, you know, sanctions in some other area in return for not shipping the launchers. But I most likely, I think the deal will proceed. The final reason too, this is a slight possibility, is that rather than the Russians wishing to supply the launchers, it could be a case where the Iranians just don't have that many. I mean, if you think about their ballistic missile arsenal, it's fairly large, but they're going to have a lot less launchers than they are missiles. They don't build a launcher per missile. Those things are very high value pieces of equipment. And it could be a case that they're providing the technology to Russia, but with the assumption that Russia will somehow work out the launch mechanisms and develop some launching system.
Yeah,
so I just hold that out as a third, somewhat distant possibility.
Check.
Thank you.
So Greg Melcher says, I've not heard anything said here between this special military operation run by Putin and the intel services and the type of general staff run operation we would expect in any invasion of Europe or NATO. Can you comment on the status of this tension between Putin, the GRU, et cetera, and the general staff? Who would like that? Julian, please.
Yeah, I can take that. It's funny, we actually have an upcoming report looking briefly at the Russian general staff. So look forward to that later on this week or next week, something like that. I'll plug that right now, where we look into some of its operations and so on. It's a very interesting question that Greg raises about the fact that the invasion of Ukraine, and especially the initial operations at the operational and operational strategic level, simply didn't accord with Russian doctrine. The way the Russian military has exercised previously, the lack of a combined arms operation, so these thunder runs to Kiev that ended up not working very well. It's almost a bigger question than we can answer. But to the point about this idea of almost internal factions inside the Russia's authoritarian regime related to the war, that is Putin and the FSB, or the intel services, on one side, and the general staff and its operation on another side. It's difficult to say. There's very little good observational data that we can get on tensions between the general staff and the political regime, the Kremlin, the Security Council, or the FSB outright, with the exception of what we saw when the Minister of Defense was changed in May, right? So we lost the long-standing Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, replaced by a sort of statist, technocratic economist, Andrei Belousov, at the same time that a light purge of the upper echelons of the Ministry of Defense's sort of deputies and sort of the political ranks of the MOD. These mostly haven't touched the general staff proper, right, which is within but separate in a certain way. So we know that there are some tensions existing. We also know, for example, that the Russia's reaction to the Kursk offensive, the command and control decisions are supposedly being taken under the auspices of the counterterrorism guidelines, legislation, and operational guidebook, which suggests, relatively speaking, more FSB control, which makes sense. They're in charge of Russia's border. All of this is to say that there's actually a lot of confusion on the degree to which there's tensions, right? We would expect, in fact, that the general staff would be quite dissatisfied with the response to Kursk not falling under their confines, but we don't know the degree to which that is fully true. And we don't know the degree of cooperation and coordination at the interagency level, at the bureaucratic level, which is a very, very long way of saying that we have to punt on this to some degree until we get more data and more information. And some of that data is going to come through the rumor mill, the gossip mill in Russia, in Moscow. Despite being a highly closed authoritarian regime, there is in fact a journalistic class that reports on these sorts of issues. Oftentimes they'll report on them a little bit later, but that's not actually that different than other journalistic classes dealing with high level, very sensitive political and military issues. That's one thing. Another aspect is we're going to learn more about sort of operational control of reaction to the Kursk incursion over time. And that will also give us a little bit more of a sense of whether or not there's persistent tensions between the FSB and the intel services and the regular Russian army. But it's a fabulous question, and it's one that we're tracking directly right now.
So here's somewhat of a curveball. When conflict becomes protracted, oftentimes the conscription age goes either down and also up. But it also often includes women, and the Russians have a long history of using women in combat in the Great Patriotic War. Do we anticipate that women will be introduced into combat forces with either a little bit more so, I guess, with the Ukrainians, but with the Russians? Gabriela.
Yeah, I can take this question due to some of our ongoing research on the Russian provision of medical care in Ukraine. So first of all, women have a very notable role in when it comes to providing medical care to the wounded, particularly even in Ukraine. Some of them are particularly in mobile, what they call essentially mobile specialized units that are quite mobile and can be stationed everywhere overall. And so if there were more introduction of women playing far more of a role in this war, it would probably affect the medical care sector first. As some of you may know or may not know, the majority of doctors in Russia are actually women. And women, particularly doctors in Russia, have a very specific role in terms of, that they can be called up for a mobilization of sorts. That is entirely in the Kremlin's prerogative. So therefore, if we are going to see kind of more of the role of women in the conflict, it would definitely be, first of all, through the medical care sector. And kind of, that's where they would particularly start, if that's any useful.
Good. So certainly we see in the Gulf of Bab el, or the Strait of Bab el Mandeb, that what oftentimes the Iranians have shows up with second-tier actors. What weapon systems gaps can we expect military exports from Russia to fill in terms of the Iranian capability index? And what is the Iranian Minister of Defense, Armed Forces, and Logistics looking to acquire from Russia in particular?
I'd be happy to take this question. There's a lot of gaps that the Russians could fill on the Iranian side. I think more so than the Iranians could do for the Russians. The question is, can the Iranians again come up with the cash to pay for those weapon systems, or are the Russians willing to provide those weapon systems simply to irritate, complicate U.S. ties in the region and issues for our allies and partners in the region? I think, I mentioned the Air Force side, the Iranian Air Force certainly has significant gaps the Russians could address, and it looks like they're starting to address those gaps. The Su-35s haven't been shipped yet, but they're scheduled to be shipped at some point in the near future, and the Iranian pilots are in Russia training on these systems right now. This cruise missile technology. So the Iranians operate a lot of different anti-ship cruise missiles, land attack cruise missiles, and they're fairly effective, but Russian cruise missile technology is really top notch. And I think that's something that the Iranians would love to get a hold of. The question is, would the Russians supply that technology, knowing potentially that it could irritate Russian allies in the region, like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, and possibly if you want to throw Israel into that equation, it's kind of unclear these days where that relationship is headed. But now you mentioned the Houthis, so looking at Iranian proxies in the region, their needs are even greater. So again, if Russia was looking to make an impact in some way that would really complicate US operations in the region, they could share that technology that I was talking about with the Houthis. You can imagine with what the Houthis are doing right now in the Red Sea and the impact that they're having on shipping in the region, the fact that most of the commercial shipping is no longer using the Red Sea. It's going all the way around, driving up shipping rates, having negative impacts on regional and global economies. Imagine if they were to acquire, for instance, Yahan anti-ship cruise missiles. It would be a much more difficult problem to deal with, or air defense technology. That's something that all the countries in the region love, is Russian air defense technology. So if the Iranians or their proxies were to acquire more advanced systems, the Iranians already have S-300. If they were to acquire S-400, or if the Houthis were to get even tactical like Tor M1 systems, again, that would be a major impact. So there are a lot of gaps there, I think, to fill for the Iranians and for their proxies. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Well, so we're right up against the bottom of time here. So if everybody can have about 15 seconds to say something, wrap up, and then I'll do the closing comments, please. And I want to also mention that we've got some great reports coming out of CNA on these topics. Gabriela's already has come out, 2 more to follow that I know of, and to stay tuned. So please, Paul, could you send off your closing comments, please?
Yes. So turning back to the mobilization, the main theme for my presentation. The Russians have continued to find ways to sustain their combat forces in Ukraine and appear to be on track to do so at the current levels for the foreseeable future. There are some indications that the pool of personnel that are more prone to join forces has been somewhat increasingly depleted, reports from inside Russia. So that bears watching. Same time, we've seen that the Kremlin has announced plans to expand the size of their ground forces, especially, partly so that they have a larger force that they can commit to battle early on to avoid some of the problems they had early on. We've seen plans to increase the size of the armed force to 1.5 million, to create new divisions and corps in the north. And so we can see that there's going to need to be some further changes in their mobilization strategy to support that. So
great.
Keep your eyes open for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, please.
Just really quickly, I'd say Russia-Iran relations on a positive glide path. Look to the strategic agreement that's coming out, or should happen fairly soon, to see what the details of that relationship will become in the outgoing years. I'm skeptical that there are going to be hardcore commitments built into that agreement, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. Thank you.
Great. Julian, please.
Right. In addition to what Mike said, I think overall we need to move beyond the idea of a transactional relationship, move it towards this understanding of a strategic partnership, one that will be there for the medium and perhaps into the long term. And finally, and this is an agreement with a variety of other research that's been done throughout. And finally, just a quick note that when we look at the relationship, it's important to dive into the specifics of exactly what dimension or aspect of it we're talking about. The overall trajectory is growing, it's increasing, but some areas are even more deep and others are still nascent.
Very well. Very well. Gabriela, please.
I guess overall, I would highlight that although our upcoming report cannot bring out kind of a linear discussion of ideas within Russian nuclear discourse, I would say that definitely the Russians are gaining lessons, kind of nuclear lessons in terms of what are the political utility of nuclear weapons from their experience in Ukraine. I would say overall that all stakeholder groups, which is this is a very sharp contrast to kind of and I want to juxtaposition them to kind of the commenting from Western analysts that, that the current strategy, the incrementalist approach of the Biden administration is bleeding out Ukraine. So in contrast, we actually find that the Russians really perceive a very big problem with the incrementalist strategy, that it has been extremely successful in terms of that it actually has been successful. And that's just a complete and utter disconnect, which is absolutely really fascinating for me in itself. I would say
I agree. That's a great thing to bring forward. So, all right, we're out of time. So, but it's overall, it's clear this conflict has reverberated far beyond the battlefield and the northern Black Sea. I anticipate the regional realignment taking shape will expand, possibly solidify with other players. The new international relationships will get established, such as Russia's importing of engineers from Africa to help in the defense industry. New technologies such as artificial intelligence and loitering drones, mass-produced one-way kinetic vehicles, now used in sea, ground, and air domains. Mass production facilities set up in labor-rich nations, for instance, is a new angle. And all these are new consequences placed in fast forward for today's military tacticians. Very much because of the adversaries, this has become a pivotal moment for international security. Foremost, the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons is the gravest threat of escalation in modern history. I think that is true. The new weapon systems, how they're being used, and the bending of international norms is a subject for further study, and certainly highlighted by this conflict and another that's occurring in the Levant, of course. Russia's internal challenges are equally significant. The deep fractures from within have aided Russia greatly. It can be said that there are teetering economies on both sides of the line, so international relationships do matter going forward. And I look forward to other opportunities to hear from CNA's analysts in the week to come. Julia, thanks for hosting this and thank you for everyone for taking your lunch hour with us. Signing off, please.
Thank you, everyone.